Part 1, Dramatic Hook, 250 words. In the early hours of July 12, 1943, German panzer crews prepared for another routine armored assault on the rolling fields near Prokhorovka, 87 kilometers southwest of Kursk, Russia. Confidence ran high among the men of the 2 SS Panzer Corps. Many had faced Soviet armor before, clunky, unreliable, easily outmaneuvered. In the weeks leading up to Operation Citadel, German intelligence had estimated fewer than 1,000 Soviet tanks in the region, with the majority described as obsolete models. Major General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army fielded some of the most advanced armored vehicles of the era, Panzer D and Tiger I heavy tanks, supported by experienced crews and mobile artillery. As dawn broke, the German lines braced for an attack they believed they could contain. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler, equipped with 77 Panthers and 15 Tiger Is, advanced in tight formation. The crews, veterans of previous Eastern Front battles, expected to encounter scattered resistance, perhaps a few dozen T-34s, easily dispatched with the new 88mm KWK-36L/56 guns. What followed was a staggering revelation. Instead of isolated skirmishes, German observers counted wave after wave of Soviet tanks breaching the mist, over 2,000 T-34s and supporting vehicles from the 5th Guards Tank Army. The sheer volume of armored steel, combined with concentrated Soviet artillery barrages, shattered any illusion of German supremacy. By midday, the largest tank engagement in history had begun, transforming the fields into a crucible of fire, metal, and unprecedented destruction. Part 2, Historical Setup, 350 words. At precisely 0430 hours on July 12, 1943, the Soviet Western Front unleashed its armored counteroffensive near the village of Prokhorovka, situated on the southern edge of the Kursk salient. The 5th Guards Tank Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, initiated the assault with 850 T-34/76 medium tanks and 268 T-70 light tanks, supported by the 2nd Tank Corps and the 18th Tank Corps. Across the divide, the German 2 SS Panzer Corps, led by SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, deployed fewer than 800 tanks, including approximately 90 Tiger I heavy tanks and 184 newly issued Panther tanks. The Soviet T-34/76, weighing 26.5 tons and armed with a 76.2 mm F-34 main gun, had become the backbone of Red Army armored forces. Its Christie suspension, 45 mm sloped armor, and diesel engine granted it mobility and resilience on the muddy Russian terrain. The T-34/85, an upgraded variant with an 85 mm ZIS S-53 gun and a 3-man turret, was beginning to enter service with select Guards units, but the bulk of the Soviet force at Prokhorovka consisted of the earlier 76 mm model. German armor had evolved as well. The Panzer D, introduced only weeks earlier, boasted a 75 mm KWK-42L/70 gun with high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, frontal glassy armor measuring 80 mm, and a top speed of 46 km per hour. The Tiger I, at 57 tons, carried the formidable 88 mm main gun and up to 120 mm of frontal armor, making it nearly impervious to most Soviet weapons at long range. Prokhorovka's geography funneled the armored formations into a 5-kilometer-wide corridor, bounded by the Sel River and a series of low ridges. Soviet minefields, anti-tank ditches, and entrenched infantry from the 29th Tank Corps created a layered defense. The Germans, unaware of the true scale of Soviet preparations, advanced with the expectation of a quick breakthrough. The technical superiority of their new tanks was offset by numerical inferiority and the density of Soviet positions concentrated along this critical sector. Part 3, Rising Tension, 300 words. At 0430 hours, Soviet artillery batteries opened fire along a 20-kilometer front, targeting German assembly areas and suspected command posts. By 0500 hours, the 5th Guards Tank Army's leading elements, including the 29th Tank Corps, began their advance, engines roaring as columns of T-34s surged forward. At 0530 hours, forward observers from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard reported the first sighting of Soviet armor massing near Oktyabrski State Farm, prompting immediate orders to deploy Panther and Tiger companies into defensive positions. On the Soviet side, Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov coordinated the assault via radio from his forward command post, directing the 18th and 29th Tank Corps to exploit gaps in the German line. At 0600 hours, Rotmistrov's crews closed to within 500 meters of the German tanks, reducing the advantage of the Panther's long-range gun. The terrain, broken by anti-tank ditches, railway embankments, and burning wheat fields, forced both sides into chaotic close-quarters combat. By 0730 hours, the intensity of the fighting escalated. Tank crews from the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich reported ammunition depletion and mounting losses as the volume of Soviet armor threatened to encircle their positions. At 0815 hours, German divisional headquarters relayed urgent requests for Luftwaffe support, while Soviet artillery shifted fire to disrupt German counterattacks. Throughout the morning, the balance of power shifted rapidly. German commanders, including SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, were forced to commit reserve battalions piecemeal. On the ground, Soviet T-34 drivers advanced at full throttle, accepting high casualties to overwhelm the technologically superior but outnumbered German tanks. As midday approached, the scale of the Soviet assault became undeniable, setting the stage for a decisive confrontation between two armored juggernauts. In the hours following the ferocious morning assault, the smoke of battle still clung to the fields around Prokhorovka. By midday, battered remnants from both sides withdrew temporarily to regroup, leaving behind a landscape littered with the twisted hulks of tanks and the scars of artillery barrages. Soviet medical units, hastily established in wooded clearings behind the front, worked frantically to treat wounded tankers ferried back by makeshift ambulances. Among the new arrivals was Captain Yuri Polivanov of the 31st Tank Brigade, whose T-34 had been immobilized by a Tiger shell. Despite his injuries, Polivanov provided a vivid account of the close-quarters chaos, describing the confusion of combat at point-blank range and the resilience of his crew under fire. On the German side, Oberstleutnant Heinrich Hank, recently assigned to the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, arrived at the divisional command post to find an atmosphere of grim urgency. Reports from frontline observers painted a picture of mounting Soviet pressure and deteriorating defensive cohesion. Messages intercepted by German signals intelligence began to reveal the scale of Soviet reserves being fed into the engagement. In Berlin, General Oberst Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops, received a series of urgent communiques detailing the unexpectedly high rate of German tank losses and the exhaustion of mechanized battalions near the southern sector. By the evening of July 12, the full extent of the day's fighting had become clear. Soviet reconnaissance patrols, emboldened by the withdrawal of some German forward elements, pushed cautiously into the contested zone to assess enemy positions. They relayed back evidence of burned-out Panthers and Tigers, as well as scattered pockets of German infantry attempting to regroup. Simultaneously, Soviet engineers worked under artillery cover to bridge anti-tank ditches and clear mines, preparing for renewed offensives. New intelligence also arrived from the Red Army's 2nd Air Army, which had observed increased Luftwaffe sorties targeting Soviet supply columns east of Prokhorovka. Colonel Ivan Sokolov, overseeing rear area logistics, issued urgent directives to reroute fuel and ammunition convoys along less exposed routes. The logistical strain was mounting on both sides, as the scale of destruction made resupply increasingly perilous. In Moscow, Stavka analysts began piecing together preliminary casualty estimates, realizing the day had likely marked one of the most intense armored clashes of the entire war. As darkness fell, both armies braced for the next phase. The outcome of Prokhorovka was still undecided, but the titanic loss of men and material was already shaping strategic thinking at the highest levels. The chaotic engagement at Prokhorovka revealed fundamental truths about the evolving nature of armored warfare on the Eastern Front. Analysts at Soviet headquarters pored over after-action reports, noting that the sheer density of tanks often fighting at ranges of less than 100 meters had neutralized many of the technological advantages held by the Germans. The vaunted 88mm guns of the Tiger tanks, so effective at long distances, were often unable to traverse quickly enough in the melee, while the Soviet T-34s, with their superior maneuverability and numbers, could swarm isolated German vehicles. Comparative studies highlighted key differences from earlier battles. In 1941 and 1942, German panzer divisions had excelled in sweeping maneuvers and deep encirclements, leveraging command flexibility and superior optics. At Prokhorovka, however, the Soviets had forced the confrontation into an attritional slugfest, blunting the effectiveness of German tactics. Soviet tank crews, many with limited training, compensated through sheer aggression, closing the distance rapidly and accepting catastrophic losses to achieve local breakthroughs. Ammunition consumption reached unprecedented levels, straining both armies' supply capabilities. German post-battle analysis noted that units such as the 1st SS Panzer Division fired nearly all their available armor-piercing rounds within a matter of hours, leaving them dangerously exposed to further attack. Maintenance and recovery units reported that many damaged German tanks had to be abandoned due to the intensity of Soviet artillery fire and the impossibility of rapid repair under battlefield conditions. Military historians have since noted the significance of air support or the lack thereof. Despite repeated German requests for Luftwaffe intervention, Soviet fighter and anti-aircraft defenses limited the effectiveness of German close air support, while Soviet ground attack aircraft inflicted heavy losses on exposed German transport columns. This mutual degradation of air assets underscored the rising importance of combined arms operations and the vulnerability of unsupported armored formations in modern warfare. In retrospect, Prokhorovka demonstrated the limits of both qualitative and quantitative approaches. The German reliance on technological superiority and veteran crews could not overcome the massed, determined assaults of the Red Army. Conversely, Soviet willingness to absorb staggering casualties set a grim precedent for the war's final years, a contest not only of machines, but of national endurance. The reverberations of July 12 were felt up and down the chain of command. In the days that followed, German field marshals convened urgent conferences to review the unfolding situation. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, architect of Operation Citadel, demanded fresh reinforcements and pressed for continued offensive action, arguing that a decisive victory was still attainable. Yet, the steady attrition of tanks and the failure to achieve a breakthrough at Prokhorovka sowed seeds of doubt within the Wehrmacht's high command. In response, German commanders issued revised orders to prioritize defensive deployments and the rapid fortification of fallback positions. The battered SS Panzer divisions received instructions to rotate out of the front line where possible for refitting, while newly arrived units, such as elements of the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion, were tasked with plugging critical gaps. The Luftwaffe, grappling with mounting aircraft losses and fuel shortages, shifted its focus toward interdiction of Soviet supply lines rather than direct air support for ground operations. On the Soviet side, General Georgy Zhukov and the Stavka leadership seized the initiative. Encouraged by the ability of their armored forces to withstand and blunt the German assault, they ordered the Western and Bryansk fronts to accelerate supporting offensives on the northern and central sectors of the Kursk salient. Emphasis shifted toward coordinated attacks designed to stretch German reserves to the breaking point. At the tactical level, Soviet tank brigades adopted new assault formations, dispersing their vehicles more widely to minimize losses from concentrated German fire. Artillery commanders integrated lessons from Prokhorovka, refining their barrages to better suppress enemy strongpoints and support advancing infantry. As mid-July wore on, the tempo of operations quickened. Both armies adjusted to the hard lessons learned on the fields near Prokhorovka, preparing for the next phase of a battle whose outcome would reverberate across the entire Eastern Front. The stage was set for a shift from desperate defense to relentless Soviet counteroffensives, heralding a turning point in the struggle for Kursk and for the fate of the war in the East. Part 1: Lesser-known details. Beneath the sweeping maneuvers and shattering offensives, the logistical sinews of both armies strained to their limits in the weeks after Prokhorovka. In a faded letter home, Guard Sergeant Alexei Shapovalov, whose unit advanced through the battered village of Belenikino in late July, described not just the chaos of battle, but the privation between engagements. "We eat whatever we find, sometimes just black bread and cold water. The trucks cannot reach us, so we carry shells by hand. In the night, I dream of potatoes, and wake to the sound of boots squelching in mud." Soviet logistical planners, already challenged by the vast distances of the steppe, grappled with the destruction of bridges and railheads from Luftwaffe raids. Makeshift repair crews worked around the clock, often under fire, to keep the flow of ammunition and fuel moving toward the front. German supply lines, too, buckled under the strain. Declassified after-action reports from Army Group South reveal a growing gap between official inventories and the harsh realities at the front. The 6th Panzer Division, for instance, reported a nominal strength of over 80 tanks in mid-July. In reality, few more than a dozen were fit for action, with the remainder sidelined by mechanical failures or lack of spare parts. In a diary entry recovered from the estate of Oberfeldwebel Karl-Heinz Mertens, a maintenance NCO, he wrote, "Our tigers stand silent, awaiting tracks that never come. We cannibalize what we can, but each day, another breaks down." The men are exhausted, and so are the machines. Environmental conditions compounded these difficulties. A series of summer storms in late July turned rural roads into impassable rivers of mud, immobilizing heavy vehicles and stalling planned advances. Soviet engineers, often overlooked in official histories, labored to lay corduroy roads and repair culverts under constant threat of artillery fire. For both sides, the battlefield became not just a contest of arms, but of endurance against rain, hunger, and exhaustion. Discrepancies between official communiques and frontline realities grew stark. High command bulletins spoke of uninterrupted momentum and triumphant advances, but field letters and after-action interviews recount units immobilized for days, casualties mounting from disease and exposure, and the ever-present fear of encirclement. One Red Army tankman, writing in a secret diary smuggled home after the war, confessed, "We were told the Germans were finished. But each day, they struck back harder than before. We wondered if Moscow truly knew what we faced." Part 2, Historian Perspectives. The interpretation of the post-Prokhorovka phase has shifted dramatically across decades of scholarship. Early Soviet-era histories, tightly controlled by state censors, cast the weeks after the battle as an unbroken string of Red Army victories, with little acknowledgement of setbacks or the profound logistical struggles. Western authors, lacking access to Soviet archives, often accepted German operational claims at face value, portraying the Wehrmacht as a force undone more by Hitler's interference than by Soviet prowess. This narrative began to unravel after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The opening of Russian military archives in the 1990s allowed historians like David Glantz and Valery Zamulin to reconstruct a fuller, more nuanced picture. Newly declassified Stavka directives and frontline reports revealed the Red Army's own costly mistakes, frontal assaults that failed to achieve their objectives, coordination problems between armor and infantry, and the staggering cost in lives for even modest gains. Conversely, German records, once considered a gold standard, were found to contain distortions and omissions, often downplaying their own losses or exaggerating enemy casualties. One pivotal discovery was a set of intercepted radio messages between German field commanders, detailing the desperate improvisation required to hold their lines. These communications, previously classified by British intelligence, exposed the extent to which local initiative rather than high command strategy dictated the tempo of the retreat. Modern academic debate, fueled by these revelations, now centers on the nature of the Kursk aftermath. Was the German withdrawal a methodical, if inevitable, response to overwhelming pressure, or a chaotic rout punctuated by local collapses? Did Soviet operational art truly mature in these weeks, or did the Red Army succeed primarily through sheer attrition? Contemporary Russian and Western scholars continue to wrestle with these questions, piecing together divergent sources to arrive at a more balanced, if still incomplete, understanding. Part 3, Human Stories. Among the countless soldiers swept up in the currents of the Kursk campaign, the fate of Private Ivan Samokhvalov stands as a testament to the war's enduring legacy. Born in a small village near Penza, Ivan was drafted at 18 and assigned to a rifle regiment advancing through the Ural salient. In a post-war interview, he recalled, "We followed the tanks, always the last to eat, the first to dig in. Our boots wore out, and our rifles jammed with dust. But I remember the faces of my comrades, boys from farms and cities, all hoping the next day would bring peace." Wounded by shrapnel in August 1943, Ivan spent months in a field hospital, returning home in 1945 a changed man. He became a teacher, haunted by memories of the friends he left behind. "I told my students that courage is not only in battle, but in carrying on when the war is over." On the opposing side, Feldwebel Otto Bauer, a tank commander from Saxony, wrote a clandestine memoir discovered decades later by his granddaughter. Bauer's Panther crew was stranded for 4 days after a breakdown during the summer rains. "We waited in the bog, engines silent, eating hard bread and watching the sky for Sturmovix. When the order came to withdraw, we burned the tank and fled on foot. I never saw my driver again." Captured by Soviet troops, Bauer spent 3 years in a Siberian labor camp before returning to Germany. He rarely spoke of the war, but in his memoir he wrote, "Survival was not victory. We returned to a land of ruins, changed in ways we could not explain." Then there is the story of Zinaida Kolesnikova, a field nurse barely out of nursing school when the battle raged. She ferried wounded men from the front lines to makeshift aid stations, enduring shellfire and exhaustion. In a rare recorded oral history, Zinaida described the chaos. The mud was everywhere. Sometimes we carried the wounded on doors or bits of fence. I held the hands of dying boys and whispered to them that they would see home again, though I knew it was not true. After the war, Kolesnikova became a doctor, dedicating her life to treating the physical and psychological wounds of survivors. The war never really ended for us, she reflected. It lived in the scars and silences. These human stories, layered atop the grand strategies and shifting scholarly debates, remind us that the struggle for Kursk was not only a contest of armies and ideologies, but a crucible of ordinary lives shaped, scarred, and sometimes redeemed by the terrible forge of war. Part 1: Strategic Consequences. In the immediate aftermath, the shattered front lines along the Eastern Front forced both Soviet and German commanders to rethink their tactical doctrines. Within days, the Wehrmacht's withdrawal triggered a cascade of hurried defensive realignments. German divisions, depleted and outmaneuvered, abandoned long-held positions and constructed new, hastily prepared fortifications further west. Soviet commanders, emboldened by their adversaries' retreat, intensified reconnaissance in-force operations and exploited gaps with mobile groups, testing, adjusting, and refining their offensive playbook. Weeks later, these adjustments reverberated across entire army groups. German logistics buckled under the strain of constant movement, and supply lines grew perilously thin. Relief units, once earmarked for the southern front, were redirected north to stem Soviet advances threatening Smolensk and the Baltic approaches. Soviet staff officers, meanwhile, pored over reports and after-action analyses, adapting their approach to combined arms operations. The Red Army's subsequent offensives grew more sophisticated, integrating armor, artillery, and infantry in ways previously unimagined. By the autumn months, the cumulative effects manifested at the campaign level. German command, alarmed by the scale of material and personnel losses, cancelled further major summer offensives on the Eastern Front. Strategic reserves earmarked for ambitious counterattacks were now diverted to reinforce a crumbling defensive line. The Soviet High Command, sensing a historic opportunity, prepared for a series of deep penetration operations that would, over the next year, roll the front inexorably westward. In the years that followed, the consequences became even more pronounced. The German war machine, stretched across multiple theaters and unable to recover its losses, permanently ceded the strategic initiative in the east. Soviet advances accelerated, culminating in the liberation of vast swaths of territory and, ultimately, the fall of Berlin. The operational methods honed in the months after Kursk, mass artillery preparation, rapid exploitation by mechanized forces, and integrated supply efforts, became hallmarks of Soviet military doctrine for decades. The battle's aftermath not only shifted the trajectory of the Second World War, but also redrew the map of Europe and set the stage for the geopolitical order that would define the post-war world. Part 2: Turning Point Analysis. Had the events unfolded differently, if the German withdrawal had transformed into a successful counterstroke, or if Soviet advances had faltered under logistical strain, the entire course of the war in the East might have shifted. Some historians draw comparisons to the First World War's Flanders offensives, where tactical exhaustion yielded little strategic gain. Yet, unlike those earlier stalemates, the repercussions here rippled far beyond the battlefield. The failure to regain the initiative doomed German hopes of stabilizing the front, while the Soviets seized upon their momentum. Contemporary analysis often juxtaposes this aftermath with other pivotal moments: the Allied breakout from Normandy, the Soviet encirclement at Stalingrad, or the American victories in the Pacific. Each represented a juncture where local gains translated into irreversible strategic shifts. For Kursk's aftermath, the difference lay not just in the scale of the engagement but in the enduring psychological blow to German command. No longer could the Wehrmacht dictate the tempo. From this point, they were forced into a reactive posture for the remainder of the conflict. Historian consensus now regards the months following this campaign as the irreversible turning of the tide in the East. While earlier scholarship sometimes minimized the operational significance, recent access to primary Soviet and German sources has illuminated the profound transformation in doctrine, morale, and strategic calculus. The ambiguity of the withdrawal, methodical in some sectors, chaotic in others, underscored the complexity of high-intensity mechanized warfare and the limits of even the most seasoned armies. Over time, understanding of these events has matured. What was once viewed as a single, decisive battle is now recognized as a fulcrum of sustained operational adaptation, the consequences of which rippled through every level of command in every subsequent campaign. Part 3: Legacy and Memorial. The war's end brought new chapters for those who survived its crucible. Ivan Samokhvalov, forever changed by his wounds and memories, became a pillar of his village, quietly shaping generations through his teaching. Otto Bauer, the German tank commander, lived out his days in a divided Germany, his war memoir passed down in silence until its discovery decades later. Zinaida Kolesnikova, tireless in her devotion, treated both physical and invisible scars in post-war hospitals, her story finally preserved in oral histories recorded by her students. Across the former battlefields, the land itself bore witness to the passage of time. In the decades that followed, memorials and museums rose from the steppes, granite monuments inscribed with thousands of names, tanks mounted atop plinths, and new forests planted as living testaments to loss and endurance. Annual commemorations now gather veterans, families, and historians, echoing with stories that refuse to fade. The Kursk State Battlefield Museum, established in 1983, draws visitors from around the world, its exhibits chronicling not only military hardware but the faces and letters of those who endured. Modern military academies, both in Russia and abroad, continue to study the operational lessons derived from the campaign's aftermath. The evolution of combined arms tactics, the importance of logistical resilience, and the value of adaptability in the face of uncertainty, all are traced to this period. Scholarship and remembrance intertwine, ensuring that the events and their lessons remain vivid long after the last witnesses have gone. To this day, the reverberations of the summer of 1943 can be measured not just in the lines drawn on maps, but in the doctrines adopted, the memorials raised, and the generations shaped by what followed. The course of the 20th century was altered, irreversibly, by the choices made and lives changed in those pivotal weeks.